The saying goes, it's the winners who write the history books. And that's definitely something to keep in mind when exploring Germany's forgotten city, Dresden. For those of you who don't know, Dresden is home to one of the most controversial events of World War II.
British bombers head for Dresden, the Saxony bastion of the Nazis along the Eastern Front.
On the evening of February the 13th, 1945, 83% of the town was wiped out in a horrific firestorm by British and American bombers. An estimated 25,000 people died, which were mainly all civilians. A bit of debate rages on the Dresden bombing. There are historical doubts on whether this was a legitimate attack, doubts even shared by the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. For a little bit of context on what I'm doing, earlier this year I had an existential moment. I probably have a little few too many for a 20-year-old. I thought, considering the price of my journalism degree was about the same as a small apartment, thanks for that Scott Morrison, I thought why don't I go travel the world and make films for a few years, while I'm young. So I did what any rational creature would do, and booked a one-way ticket to Europe. I'd heard of Dresden before, but not enough to make an informed opinion, so I set myself a challenge. I would bike from my hostel around the city streets and alleyways, slowly unravelling one of the most controversial stories of World War II, and seeing if there was anything that this grand city could teach me. The following video is brought to you by Dehancer. Dehancer is a film emulation program designed to turn your footage into nostalgia. They have 63 cinematic film profiles, as well as cool features like grain, halation, and my personal favourite, bloom. They've just released a new update, which includes a tool to add film damage to your footage, as well as much more. I'm very grateful to be sponsored by these guys. I constantly find myself using the program to turn my footage from looking like a European winter to an Australian summer. You can use my code PAT_Franco for a 10% discount on all their products. Now, back to the video.
Preceded by a shower of flares, German bombers rained fire and high explosive bombs in their most savage attack on London. Here again is the blood, the sweat and tears that Nazi warfare brings to the men, women and children of city, town and village.
Civilian bombing was commonplace throughout World War II. It was seen as a tactic to inflict terror and demoralise civilians. For context, by 1942, British civilians had suffered in their masses from German air raids, known as the Blitz, which had killed over 40,000 people. In response to an air campaign proving to be increasingly difficult, the newly appointed head of the British Bomber Command, a man nicknamed Arthur Bomber Harris, ordered in a new strategy known as area bombing, where the RAF would bomb not just the city's industry and infrastructure, but the civilian housing as well.
They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind.
Now when I say Dresden is Germany's forgotten city, I'm referring to two things. Firstly, when looking at World War II, there are so many famous events people think of. Dunkirk, D-Day, Hiroshima, and while it's still well known, the firebombing of Dresden doesn't have such a strong public knowledge. And second, when travelling to Germany, most people think to visit Berlin for its exotic nightclubs and Munich for its famous Oktoberfest. A little light is ever shone upon Dresden. Known as the Jewel of Saxony, it was once the cultural heart of Germany. There is a certain beauty in the cracks of its overgrown buildings, and a bohemian scent in the air when you walk through it, especially in the city's new town. Before 1945, Dresden was virtually untouched by bombings. The city was layered with centuries-old architecture, and mainly acted as a shelter for refugees around Germany. Some people even thought the city was just too beautiful to be bombed. The local Nazi leader at the time was so complacent in Dresden that he'd made little preparation for an air attack, and apart from the one major bunker that he'd constructed for himself, the city had very few bomb shelters. On an unusually clear winter's night, hundreds of British Lancasters crept across the night sky, dropping aluminium foil as they went, to prevent German radars from knowing precisely where they were going. At this point in the war, Dresden contained no major anti-aircraft guns, as they'd all been moved to Berlin, and there wasn't a single German fighter that took to meet the RAF.
The night sky is pitted with aircraft, vari-coloured target markers.
The target given by Bomber Command was the city's central stadium, the heart of residential Dresden. Due to the conditions, the Pathfinders dropped their markers with an unwavering accuracy, And in a series of 2 waves, each 3 hours apart, thousands of explosives punched holes through the city's rooftops below, followed by waves of incendiaries that set everything on fire. The technique was perfected to create maximum destruction.
It was terrifying. At first I thought it was the end of the war, but when it didn't stop, I believed it was the end of the world.
Dresden's tightly packed streets and medieval wooden houses were the perfect fuel for the fire, and sturdy winds expanded the flames across the city in a self-eating blaze. The result was an unstoppable firestorm, uprooting trees and lifting people into the air.
All I saw was rubble, 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 burned houses and people searching for loved ones. They had no belongings anymore, and the dead were everywhere.
Reports reveal that those who tried to escape the fire by running into the reservoir were boiled alive, and that those who stayed in their cellars were simply cooked by the heat. It's a horror that one can't even begin to imagine, an image straight from Dante's Inferno. The Americans arrived the next morning. Their bombers were aimed at the military marshalling yards in the city's industry, but due to all the smoke in the air, this unfortunately just caused further destruction. It took 7 days for a team to enter the city's one main air raid shelter, but once inside, they discovered a horrible sight. All 1,000 people had melted. All they found was brown, green liquid and bones. Dresden is known as the raid that went horribly right. 25,000 people, mainly all civilians, lost their lives. Dresden today has been completely rebuilt. It's a weird juxtaposition. A place so beautiful was once home to such a terrible event. The Old Town district has been meticulously constructed to what it once was, and if you didn't know what had happened here, you'd be none the wiser. Immediately after the attack, the public was shocked. It wasn't like what they'd heard before. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister at the time, decides to spin the story, claiming that 200,000 civilians had died instead of 25,000. Even Winston Churchill expressed doubts immediately after the attack. It takes years for Dresden to recover. After Soviet occupation, it wasn't until 2005 that the city's main Lutheran church was fully refurbished. The sound of church bells finally ringing after decades was a symbolic moment in the city's history. A controversial debate on the Dresden firestorm continues today. Historians question whether the destruction of German cities actually thwarted the Nazi war effort or simply caused the death of civilians. Some historians have noted Dresden's industrial significance. Its factories were being used for the war effort, and the central rail hub was acting as a corridor for German reinforcements towards the Eastern Front. A common argument behind Dresden's bombing was that it was in retaliation to the Nazis' blitz of British cities. Yet, many also argue that Dresden was a complete moral failing for the Allies. The Dresden firebombing occurred towards the end of the war, when Nazi strength was dwindling and the Soviet army was advancing from the east, although it was not known that the end of the war would only be 3 months away. Victor Gregg is a World War II veteran, who was a prisoner of war in Dresden at the time.
It dehumanises anything that you've experienced before. I've been through 6 years of war. I've lost all but 3 of the 28 blokes I joined up with in 1937. I've been in every battle in the Middle East. I've been in Italy, to come home, I'd been captured at Arnhem, but nothing prepared me for seeing women and children alight and flying through the air. I never blamed the airmen. I never blamed them because they was the same as the same blokes in the Merchant Navy. They're putting their life at risk every time they went up, and they lost a lot of men. 55,000. But I said, and I still say, and I've said it in print and I've said it on broadcast, I'll never forgive the people who ordered those raids. We were supposed to be the good guys. We was going to war to rescue Europe from the evil of the Third Reich. And we finished up being worse than they were. I'm not going to say we, because what annoys me is all this was done in our name.
Arthur Harris is one of the most controversial figures to emerge from World War II. It wasn't until 2011 that Bomber Command received a memorial in Britain, more than 65 years after the war, and only then with great controversy. I find it interesting in history how there can be multiple interpretations of the same event. The story of Dresden paints an interesting and relevant picture. It reminds us to remember the forgotten victims of war, while also recognising the evil that led to World War II. Most importantly, it's about remembering the thousands of people who tragically lost their lives on February the 13th. Today, Dresden is a beautiful place. Its city soul still shines like a jewel, and is one of my favourite spots in Europe. After a long day, I decided to finish off with a beer in the park. My legs needed a break from all the historical biking I'd done. Like me, there are hundreds of people drinking beer in Dresden's park. Quirky cafes are littered amongst its hidden alleyways, which then turn into bars once the sky goes from blue to black. Dresden carries a heavy past. Blackened bricks from the city's buildings are entrenched with a reminder of a terrible event, yet I can see how the place has moved forward. I set out to explore one of the lesser known corners of Europe, and Dresden is not disappointed. If you ever make your way through the capital of Saxony, I'd highly suggest that you do some historical biking on an overcast day. Dresden, you truly are a forgotten gem.